So, my intent at first was to make a video examining just how authentic Turning Red's portrayal of the Chinese Canadian diaspora experience is. I mean, I seemed pretty well placed to do this. First of all, I was born and raised here in Toronto, where Turning Red is set. I myself am Chinese Canadian, just like the 13-year-old protagonist of the movie, Mei Lin. I have also had my fair share of crushes on boy band singers, and I'm also a writer. My debut middle grade horror novel, Ravenous Things, comes out this summer from Disney Hyperion, and my book is also set in Toronto, just like Turning Red. Now, full disclosure, my book is being published by Disney Hyperion, which is, of course, part of the Disney Corporation, which is the distributor of Turning Red. But all the opinions and views in this video are my own and do not reflect those of my publisher. So, I ran into a little problem when crafting this video. The word authenticity. It's a big word, a loaded word. And I've always been someone who's been hesitant to pull out a big pointing stick and say, this movie is authentic representation. It's always felt like a very binary word, very black and white. And so, I thought it might be more interesting to approach the idea of authenticity sideways, if you will. I'm going to compare and contrast Turning Red's portrayal of Toronto with that of other movies set in this same city. This is going to be a deep dive, so I suggest you settle in, pour yourself a nice hot cup of maple syrup, and let's get started. Let's talk about the setting of Turning Red. Toronto. It's Canada's biggest city in terms of population, not landmass. That honor goes to Latuque, Quebec. It's also the financial epicenter of Canada, and by that I mean it's where our stock market and everything is, so calm down, Alberta. I know you've got all that sweet, sweet oil money. And it's also one of the biggest film and production cities in the world, fourth place behind Vancouver, Los Angeles, and New York. Now, despite all of this, Toronto still has sort of a nebulous identity on the world stage. I mean, our city doesn't exactly have the strongest branding. We're not, say, a Paris, the city of love, or a New York, the Big Apple. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Or a London, Buckingham Palace, and the royal family, minus Harry, and please don't ask about Prince Andrew. So my theory is this all has to do with media representation, and specifically Hollywood representation. Because if you're not projected up on the silver screen or streaming on Netflix or Disney Plus or Prime or on your uncle's grotty old VHS tapes, then you don't really exist at all. And when it comes to representation on screen in Hollywood, Toronto doesn't really exist. I mean, there's good reason for this, because we are, in fact, a city in Canada, and Hollywood is an American endeavor. But even when we compare ourselves to Hollywood depictions of other international cities, like London or Paris or Cairo, Toronto barely makes a blip on the radar. So remember how I said that Toronto has a huge film and television production industry? Well, if all those productions are filming in the city, then surely the city has plenty of representation on screen, right? Well, no, not really, because the vast majority of productions filming here are American, and most of those productions have stories that are actually set in other cities. So I thought of a really fun way to illustrate this fact by showing you clips and screenshots of myself as an extra in various American productions that filmed here in Toronto but are set elsewhere. There I am in USA Network's TV show Suits, set in New York City. That's me as a very bloody jump scare in Damien from the A&E channel, also set in New York City. That's me in Shadowhunters from the Freeform network, which once again takes place in New York City. There I am again in FX Network's The Strain, also set in New York City. There I am protesting in The Expanse from the Sci-Fi Network. The scene is New York City of the future. And finally, there I am in Chloe, a movie I will be discussing further in this video. Funny thing is, this film is actually set in Toronto, but this is the one and only scene within the entire movie set at New York University, which is located in, you guessed it, New York. So now that we've had that stroll down memory lane, you're probably shouting at the screen right now, what does this have to do with Turning Red? Well, Turning Red is an American production that is emphatically set here in Toronto. That makes it a delightful, maple-flavored anomaly. There are only a handful of Hollywood films not only filmed here in Toronto, but set here as well. So I thought it would be very illuminating to take a close look at the distinctive way each of these filmmakers sees Toronto. So what exactly are these other movies I'm going to be using as a sort of yardstick to measure exactly what Turning Red is doing in its portrayal of Toronto? Well, first of all, we have Chloe, directed by Adam McGoyan, starring Julianne Moore, Amanda Seyfried, and Liam Neeson. Next up, we have Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, directed by Edgar Wright, starring Michael Cera and Mary Elizabeth Winstead. And finally, we have Enemy, directed by Denis Villeneuve, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Melanie Laurent. Now, we're going to take a good hard look at how each of these directors filmed Toronto. Actually, scratch that. Film is probably the wrong word. It's too objective. It almost sounds like the filmmakers simply pointed their 35mm cameras at the city of Toronto, yelled action, and then captured a perfect, objective, dispassionate portrait of this metropolis. I think then a better word to use would be construct. How do these varied filmmakers construct Toronto on screen? Because when it comes to filmmaking, they are doing just that. Constructing, building. And no, I'm not just referring to the computer-generated imagery they had to model and render for Turning Red. What I mean is that every filmmaker, even those shooting live action, even those filming in a real-world city, even then, they build that city from scratch, brick by brick, establishing shot by establishing shot. It's about dreaming up a vision of the city that suits the specific story they are telling, and then finding the right angles, locations, color grading to create that specific version of the city on screen. In the book Cinematic Urbanism, A History of the Modern from Real to Real, Nazar Al-Sayed explores the relationship between real-world cities and their silver screen counterparts. In his book, he says, "No medium has ever captured the city and the experience of urban modernity better than film. Indeed, the relationship between the city and the cinema, although less than a century old, is a strong and well-established one. The images and sounds found in movies today routinely bring people the experience of distant cities they may never visit. Film also captures the mentalité of society, disclosing much about its inner as well as outer life." In this passage, Al-Sayed discusses just how powerful the medium of film is. Movies don't simply convey to an audience what any given far-off city might look like or how it might feel to live there. No, even more astonishingly, movies also have the potential to give that audience a real sense of the very inner essence of the city, its mentalité, or in other words, the collective values and beliefs of that city. So I think Al-Sayed's quote here alludes to a question that every filmmaker must ponder once they've decided to set their movie in a real-world city. Let's suppose for a second that I'm Steven Spielberg, and I've decided to set my next Indiana Jones film in Toronto. Should I construct a version of Toronto that purely serves the plot, the story of my movie? Or do I create a vision of the city that captures the very inner essence of its soul? And here's where that word authenticity comes into play again. Some might argue that the most important thing is for this version of the city on screen to feel authentic to the specific story being told. It's not necessarily about slavishly reflecting the experiences of every average Joe citizen in the city. It's about the story. Now, after rewatching all these movies for this video, I found myself stuck at first. I mean, how to even start? What framework should I use to discuss each of these filmmakers' portrayal of Toronto? Then it hit me. It's not really about the setting, it's about the way the characters interact with their surroundings. And more specifically, it's about the way each of the characters interacts with the public and private locations within the city. How do they interact with public transit, for example? How do they navigate the city's many neighborhoods and parks? What do the spaces these characters choose to inhabit say about their stories? What does it say about the filmmaker's point of view? So let's start with Turning Red. The locations depicted in this movie reflect a fairly tight sphere. It's about a 13-year-old girl and her family and friends, so most of the scenes take place in her home, the temple her family maintains, her school, and the Chinatown neighborhood that contains all of the above. The first thing that struck me when rewatching this movie were how many scenes we get of Mei Lin in between pivotal locations. We are constantly seeing her traversing the bustling Chinatown sidewalks. Several of the scenes involve her bonding with her friends as they walk through their neighborhood, or Mei Lin navigating the crowd solo to make it home on time. I think that by situating these scenes in public, we, the viewer, are given a shorthand as to what Mei Lin, and by extension, the entire movie, is about. She is a 13-year-old girl coming into her own. She delights in being loud and extroverted, and a chaotic force in the world. Her personality is too big to be contained by the walls of her home or her school or the temple her family runs. It's best suited outside on a busy sidewalk, where she can do cartwheels and perform impromptu choreography with her buddies. Now, Mei Lin turns into a huge red panda whenever her emotions run high. Her oversized proportions in those transformation scenes really brings this point home. In these moments, not only is her personality too big to be contained indoors, but her supernaturally ginormous panda-sized body as well. Now, let's take a hard left turn from this family-friendly film to an R-rated thriller, Chloe. But unlike the Big Red Panda movie, these characters barely seem to spend any time outside. We do get glimpses of them dashing straight from their luxury sedans and taxicabs into restaurants or bars or bistros. The first thing this signals to us, the viewer, is class and money. Catherine is a gynecologist in a fancy-ass clinic with a killer view. Her husband is a college professor, and they live in a house that was probably featured on the cover of Architectural Digest. I mean, look at it. They are loaded. So, the Toronto these characters inhabit doesn't exactly include extensive sidewalk strolling or hanging out in the street amongst us rabble. For Catherine, the public realm of her city, of her Toronto, is all about indoor protected spaces. Expensive restaurants, swanky bars, trendy cafes, and the lobbies of five-star hotels. Now, aside from just being a signifier of privilege and wealth, all of these swanky indoor places that Catherine hangs out in also delivers to the viewer another very important message. This movie is about secrets, about taboo desires, about whispered scheming. Catherine is fearful that her husband might be cheating on her, so she enlists the help of a sex worker to test her husband's fidelity. The salacious details that Chloe, the sex worker, delivers to Catherine throughout the movie are too dirty, too taboo to soil the realm of the domestic. That's why it's best delivered in public, in the safety and anonymity of a sultry cocktail bar or in a quiet hotel room. Unlike Turning Red's Mei Lin, who wants her business loud and proud out there for all to see, Catherine is barely able to whisper her innermost desires. And what better place to whisper a secret than a bar that charges $20 for tonic water and has a valet waiting outside in sub-zero weather? Am I right? Speaking of public spaces, we do get one very significant scene in a public location that isn't so swanky. It's Allen Gardens, a greenhouse located in a city park downtown. This is a location readily available to anyone and everyone, even us unwashed rabble. No $20 tonic waters here. And so, it's notable that the scene that takes place in this greenhouse is one of transgression, of breaking the rules, or more specifically, breaking the sanctity of monogamous marriage. This is where we see Catherine's husband and Chloe, well, scandalize the orchids, let's say. In this vision of the city, any public spaces not designed exclusively for the moneyed class, like this greenhouse, is seen as dangerous, illicit, existing outside of protected boundaries. And that brings us to Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Like all the others, this is also set in contemporary Toronto. It's about 20-something musician/slacker Scott Pilgrim and his messy attempts at wooing the girl of his dreams, which often involves anime-inspired epic battle sequences. In terms of the way the characters interact with their city, it's somewhat similar to Turning Red. Lots and lots of scenes of them outside, walking through snowy neighborhoods, haunting the alleyways between dive bars and indie music venues, and just generally vibing together on city sidewalks. The functional reason for this is, once again, well, money. These are aspiring 20-something musicians who live in crappy basement apartments. They don't have money to be driving around everywhere or taking Ubers or taxi cabs like Mr. Professor and Mrs. Gynecologist. Let's look at the scene in which Scott Pilgrim and Ramona, his love interest, stumble across an empty city park. It's a sweet moment between two characters who are just starting to open up to one another. This public setting, an unremarkable neighborhood park, is shot like a desolate and isolated island within a sea of snow. But the movie does not frame it as a dangerous place or the setting of illicit rule breaking. Quite the opposite. It's a safe space, a space where two young lovers can get to know one another. Very different from how public outdoor spaces are portrayed in Chloe. Now, continuing the theme of public spaces, let's turn our attention to public transit. Yes, on the face of it, public transit is simply a means for the citizens of any given city to travel from point A to point B. But when it comes to how it's portrayed on film, it speaks volumes as to what the central themes of a movie are. Now let's jump back into Turning Red. In the first few minutes of the film, we get a sequence in which Mei Lin breaks the fourth wall a la Ferris Bueller or Zach Morris, and she gives us the lowdown on who she is as a person. During this sequence, she proudly shows off her MetroPass from the Toronto Transit Commission, and she rides one of the city's iconic streetcars. Now, what is this all telling us? Well, I think for the viewer, it's telegraphing to us that the city isn't just some faceless monolith to our main character. Quite the opposite. It's an integral part of Mei Lin's life. It's part of her journey of self-actualization. She's a 13-year-old girl on the go. She's rushing headlong towards teenagedom, towards a bright future. And the public transit system in this movie, all bright and shiny and friendly, is helping to carry her towards that future. I mean, look at how Mei Lin interacts with the streetcar in this short scene. While waiting in line to board, she joyfully shows off her cartwheeling abilities. She presents us with her MetroPass like it's a badge of honor. She finishes her math homework. She jokes around with a random stranger. You see, the transit system isn't simply running on rails. It's helping to run Mei Lin's life, moving things along smoothly. I mean, let's even take a closer look at the aesthetics of the streetcar itself. At first glance, it looks like a spot-on reproduction of its real-world counterpart. but eagle-eyed Torontonians will notice that the filmmakers made very deliberate design changes here. The movie's version of the streetcar is a little bit chonkier, a bit rounder in the edges. It succeeds in making our already adorable-looking streetcar into something even more lovable, something you want to give a big hug, as if it were, well, a fuzzy red panda. Now, let's contrast this with an altogether different streetcar scene in another movie, Enemy. Once again, as with all the others, this film is set in contemporary Toronto, but this time, it's a taut psychological drama. Its main character, Adam, is a mild-mannered university professor whose life turns upside down when he discovers a local actor, Anthony, who is his exact double, his doppelganger. There's this scene where, in pursuit of answers, Anthony follows Adam's girlfriend onto a streetcar. Now, let's take a look at how the streetcar is shot in this scene. The filmmakers show us the exterior of the streetcar using a very unusual angle. We see its roof, its metallic moorings, and the web-like electric cables it is attached to. It gives us, the audience, a sense of unease, of menace even. Quite the opposite of the cuddly streetcar we see in Turning Red. Inside the streetcar, this sense of unease continues. It's rush hour, so it's crowded and uncomfortable. And what's worse, the crowd gives cover to Anthony. It allows him to creep on this unsuspecting woman unnoticed. In this vision of Toronto, public transit, and by extension, the entire city, is a menacing and dangerous place. In the film Chloe, streetcars also make an appearance, albeit a less obvious one. As I said before, a lot of the scenes take place in swanky restaurants and bistros and bars, where hushed conversations happen between Catherine and Chloe. And interestingly, in these scenes, we can often hear streetcars passing by outside, just out of view. It's a very distinctive sound that most Torontonians would recognize. That specific shriek of metal wheels grinding along rails. This sound serves to emphasize that Catherine and Chloe, in conspiring together, exist in their own little cocoon, adjacent to, but ultimately removed from the wider city, the wider world beyond their cozy rendezvous spots. In other words, when they're together, although they could hear the sounds of the city around them, it's as if they've stepped off into their own private dimension in which only Chloe, Catherine, and their taboo secrets exist. The film's director, Adam Egoyan, who, by the way, himself is also Torontonian, confirms in an interview with the Toronto Star that the streetcar sounds were in fact a very purposeful choice. Quote, "Sounds are also really important. Every scene in this film is shot on, with the exception of Yorkville, on a streetcar line. You have College Street, you have Dundas, you have Queen, and the passing of the streetcars is a really sexy sound." Unquote. In that quote, Adam Egoyan emphasizes how sexy these streetcar sounds are. That, of course, is very significant for this movie because it's a film all about seduction and romance gone wrong. It's about lust leading to jealousy and obsession. All of those scenes in swanky bars and restaurants are filmed with soft focus and dim lighting, effectively painting a portrait of a city that is alluring and seductive, if a bit dangerous. Now, a completely different portrait of the city is painted in Enemy. In this movie, Toronto is not sexy, it's sinister. The striking cinematography conveys that well. Every scene is color graded into a jaundiced, sickly yellow, and the city itself seems entirely leached of distinctive color. We're shown vast expanses of brutalist concrete architecture, ugly highway overpasses, and endless ranks of nondescript skyscrapers. The aesthetic is soulless and claustrophobia-making. This serves the story very well, of course, because Adam himself is going through an existential crisis. He feels trapped in his mundane existence, unfulfilled in his career, and disconnected emotionally from his girlfriend. In an interview with IndieWire, director Denis Villeneuve speaks of these aesthetic choices. Quote, "But the thing is, I wanted the city to feel that fear, that paranoia, a claustrophobic feeling. I wanted to add a smoggy effect, bringing that kind of yellow color. It was the color that I felt when I read the book. So, with the cinematographer Nicolas Bouldoux, we tried to find that feeling of the pressure and the character coming from the heat." Now, I've been talking a lot about how Toronto is portrayed in these various movies, so I think I need a moment to just take a pause and discuss the aesthetics of the real world Toronto. What does Toronto look like? Now, I've lived here all my life, so I think it's best if we go to an impartial source, someone visiting the city for the first time. What will their first impression be? Here's the late Anthony Bourdain, a chef and travel documentarian. It's a clip from his food and travel show, The Layover. Watch him give his very first impressions of Toronto.
It's not a good-looking city.
It's not a good-looking town. Well, they sort of got the list of the architectural fads of the 20th century. That's crypto-fascist Bauhaus. You know, Mussolini would have been perfectly home at that one. And, you know, looks like every public school in America, every third-tier city library, Soviet chic, but ugly, glass box, like a Roach Motel.
Yeesh. I mean, that's not making it onto our license plates anytime soon, is it? So, is Anthony right? Is Toronto ugly? Well, no. And yes? I think the fair way to put it is, I think Toronto's beauty isn't always immediately apparent. I mean, don't get me wrong. Our city does have its fair share of handsome Victorian and Edwardian oldies and award-winning modernist architecture, but we also do have our fair share of absolutely fugly 80s skyrises and uninspiring glass condominiums. Now, if you ask me, I'd say the most beautiful thing about our city is the people. Hold on, don't turn the video off yet. I'm not trying to be trite or Pollyanna-ish about this. What I mean is that Toronto is home to a vast array of ethnicities and nationalities. Some publications have gone so far as to call Toronto the most multicultural city in the world. Here's a clip from the British Broadcasting Corporation's podcast, More or Less Behind the Stats, in which they discuss what makes Toronto the most multicultural city in the world.
But actually, we think the most diverse city on Earth is...
Oh, Canada, our home and native land.
Toronto in Canada. That's Canada's national anthem, by the way, Charlotte.
Thanks for that. I kind of guessed from the words.
Toronto has a 51% foreign-born population and more than 230 nationalities living there. According to the 2011 census, the biggest single ethnic group is recorded as South Asian at 12.3%, which is mainly Indians and Pakistanis. But there are lots of other big populations, 10% Chinese, 8.5% black, 5% Filipino, and a big spread of other minorities too.
So, pretty comprehensively, London is not the most diverse city?
Well, it does seem to be a bit behind the top two, competing for third place with cities like Auckland, Sydney and Los Angeles.
Now, there are some critics who say that's not exactly a true moniker, but let's roll with it. Does this mean we live in a post-racial utopia and that we've solved racism? No. Hell no. No. But does it mean that a large array of ethnicities and nationalities live together in this one city in what could pass as fairly functional harmony? Yeah, I'd say that. I bring this all up because we can see this very particular type of beauty on display in Turning Red's vision of Toronto. You'll notice that for most scenes in this movie, the camera angle is kept quite low at a very human scale to keep the emphasis on the diverse array of humanity in the city. What is highlighted here are the people and how they fill up the space. Even in the action sequences, the camera's point of view is generally kept at a very relatable angle, as if the camera operator were running around on the sidewalk, dodging pedestrians as she filmed the scene. The beauty on display isn't about towering monuments, the CN Tower excluded. The beautiful here is defined by less showy things. Cluttered but quaint shop fronts, graffiti tags and painted murals in alleyways. A small, quiet temple situated in the middle of a busy market neighborhood. In this movie, beauty has everything to do with the life teeming within the city, and this totally fits in with the movie's themes of growing up and self-actualization, because so much of what Mei Lin aspires to has to do with people and her connections to them, bonding with her friends, crushing on the boy who works at the local convenience store, hanging out with a whole bunch of teens at a wild, raging boy band concert. Now, contrast this with the Toronto in Enemy. We get lots of shots of the city skyline from high up, completely disconnected from the humanity below. Even when the camera is down at the level of the characters, there's something cold and inhumane about the compositions. Characters are often portrayed alone, with stark dystopian-looking architecture rising up around them. The effect is claustrophobic and unnerving, a fitting vibe for a movie about existential angst and paranoia. So I started off this video talking about authenticity, which means a question you might be thinking right now is, of all the movies I discussed today, which one most authentically portrays Toronto? Which one is authentically the Six? Which one would Drake proudly screen in his home theater? Before I answer, I think it's best if we hear again from director Denis Villeneuve. Quote, "The beauty of Toronto is that it has not been in a lot of movies, for itself at least. I mean, most of the time, Toronto is shot to portray something else. There's not a lot of movies where you can see Toronto as Toronto. There's a sense of virginity there. I felt that the place it didn't have any relationship with images coming from other movies. In my mind, I was totally free, like it was a virgin landscape." What Denis is saying in this quote is that the general movie-going public doesn't have a real sense of Toronto's personality. It's virginal, a blank slate on which any filmmaker can tell their story. And, well, I think that's pretty cool. I like that the city is relatively free of baggage for people wanting to set stories here, because the city can be many things to many people. I'd argue that each of the films I talked about today feel authentic to different experiences I've had with my city. On a good day, Toronto feels like a city rife with possibilities, a place where I'm free to be me. A place I can fall in love with someone in a snowy park. A place I can hang out with my friends in front of a 24-hour convenience store. And on bad days, the city can feel like an ugly place, a lonely place, a place where it's hard to make connections with other people. In the end, Toronto is simply the place I call home, and I hope that increasingly I see more and more fictional characters take up residence here. Till next time. So if you like this video, give me a like and hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be doing more videos about deep dives into pop culture and criticisms and close readings about film and TV shows and whatever I might be interested in. So please continue watching if you want to see more. I have some other videos already up on my channel. They're mostly have to do with myself as an author, as an illustrator. But moving forward, the videos I'm going to be putting on this channel are mostly going to be like this, video essays. So I hope you stick around.